We'll be talking about steps to develop a business strategy to address climate risks and examples of adaptation options that can help businesses become climate resilient, and also provide you with some resources to help you along the way if you have further interest and you're seeking further information. I'm also hoping that this will be a very interactive session where we can exchange ideas on how some of you have been able to address climate change and making your businesses more resilient. With that, I'd like to begin to discuss about risks. As you may see in this graph, that the world is full of a range of different risks, anywhere from food security crisis. Sorry, hold on one moment, please. Apologies for that. So as you may see on this graph, that there is a range of different risks that we face. Anything from food crisis to, sorry, just one moment, to the future of urban planning, energy and price shocks. But I think, as you can see in this graph, the biggest risks that we face right now in terms of likelihood and impact are related to extreme weather events and natural disasters. So these are issues that we have to take on as businesses because they will definitely affect productivity. And so, and these risks in particular will especially affect those sectors that are most dependent on natural resources. So this includes sectors such as forestry, agriculture, and tourism. So these climate-related risks are very much prevalent across Africa. So as you can see here, that we have a couple of different hotspots, and these hotspot areas are where the risks are higher. So if we take, for instance, East Africa, as you may see, there's a circle around the Kilimanjaro area. And this is a high-risk area because Kilimanjaro is facing a lot of changes in terms of ice melts, which will definitely affect the ecosystem all around it, which will eventually affect people who depend on the Mount Kilimanjaro ecosystem for their livelihoods. You can see similar risks in Central Africa and West Africa. And as you can see here, there are different types of climate risks. They could be risks related to anything related to coral bleaching, especially on, let's say, if you're looking at Madagascar and East Africa. There's a lot of risk in terms of desertification because in many parts of Africa we are facing drier conditions. You'll see areas with less precipitation, which means less rainfall than predicted. So all of these factors will most certainly affect agriculture and forestry. So this is just to give you an overview of the climate risks that are pervasive all over the African continent. So in terms of climate risks that are most prevalent in Africa, it would be definitely floods and droughts. And climate change affects markets for tree-based products and economic development because of floods and droughts. Floods in particular can affect processing centers where timber and non-timber forest products are stored and developed into marketable products. Droughts can affect tree growth itself and destroy crops and livestock as water dries up. Climate change could be disruptive in terms of quality and quantity of products. This is why we need to manage climate risks so that businesses can remain functional and profitable. So in order to manage climate risks, what we need to do is adapt to climate change, which means we need to take measures to reduce the vulnerability of natural and human systems against the actual climate change effects. In my next slide, I have a summary of a range of impacts or business consequences in terms of how these impacts of flooding and droughts affect business consequences. So if we take a look at flooding of manufacturing premises, we will most likely face loss of access to deliveries, business interruptions, and impact on reputation, where this particular firm may not be reliable enough to produce certain products, which will for sure affect the bottom line in terms of productivity, loss of sales, and impact on future sales. And similarly, if we look at water shortages due to droughts, we could have increased water rates, which would make it expensive for businesses to produce certain things, which could lead to business interruptions. And as climate becomes better suited to certain trees and crops, businesses may have to actually change the types of trees and crops it relies on to produce certain products. So all of these different impacts would affect the bottom line again, even similarly with floods. In terms of droughts, the way in which the bottom line would be affected would be increase in raw material costs, drop in productivity, and loss of sales. However, we're really facing a global trend, a global shift in the way in which we think about climate change and climate resilience. So as you may see from this graph, more and more companies are moving from a very corporate social responsibility mindset to a more climate resilience mindset. So in the early days, many companies around the world were much more focused on corporate social responsibility. And this would involve predominantly social responsibility focused with an emphasis on reputation management. It would involve few efforts to integrate into operational, strategic, or financial planning. These businesses were not thinking about climate risks and how to integrate them into operations. But over time, we have sort of the second generation type of companies where environmental risk management is coming to the forefront, where companies are concerned about minimizing impacts of rising environmental concerns. And here we have companies that recognize that there are environmental risks that will affect performance. And these are companies where environmental risk management programs have limited links to corporate management strategies. So you're seeing environmental risks a lot more at the forefront. The trend now is to focus much more on climate risks and strategy, where physical and transitional climate risks are linked to strategies and frameworks and operation in all companies, really. That's the ideal goal, because as we've discussed, climate change will affect the bottom line, and therefore climate risks need to be taken into account. They need to be embedded into strategic assessments and operational planning. And climate resilience could also be leveraged as a competitive advantage. So this is the trend that we're seeing right now. So in addition to the climate risks we face, which is predominantly floods and droughts in Africa, there are many other incentives to address climate change, and I'm going to go over these incentives. So from an investor perspective, for instance, if you take a bank, banks provide finance for small and medium scale enterprises to use to invest in producing a certain product, for instance. There are trends growing in the banking sector where more and more banks are creating environmental, social, and governance guidelines that integrate sustainability concerns into their lending practices. And so if small and medium scale enterprises try and approach banks to get finance to invest in a certain product, they may have to follow these environment and social and governance guidelines, which includes how a company addresses climate risks. Banks are now interested in seeing what things are in place, what kind of operations or strategies are in place in the small business for them to provide finance. So the banking sector is also changing and demanding that kind of demanding that companies follow such guidelines that include incorporating climate risks. When it comes to regulators, and this I'm thinking more about the national government, for instance, regulators are policymakers and who focus on reducing the risk of climate change. And many of you may have heard about the 2015 Paris Agreement. This is a global level agreement that many countries in Africa are actually part of. They're signatories to this agreement, which is a commitment. It's an international commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to also reduce the impacts of climate change. And so governments are changing their mind frames and implementing guidelines that enable or sometimes force small and medium scale enterprises to comply with protocols that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or comply with protocols that really foster how to reduce impacts of climate change and adapt to climate change. Customers are really also changing their mindset. With information explosion, advanced technology shifts, and new consumer preferences, they're really transforming the buying patterns in goods and services. Customers are increasingly seeking products that have been sourced and manufactured with reducing the carbon footprint in mind, or you know, they're looking for products that have less impact on environmental factors and really address climate change. While such products are sold at a premium, customers have shown willingness to pay for them, and customers develop increasingly high expectations with respect to sustainable brands. And so they're really looking for companies that address environmental issues and climate change issues. Another incentive to also address climate change is the supply chain. Related to the supply chain. So these are physical risks to operations and supply chains that can result from immediate impact of extreme weather events. While such weather events can be uncertain, they really still need to be addressed. Because if you're a company that relies on a different company for a different product, you know, that your supply chain could easily be hit, and you would have to figure out ways in which to get that product in an alternative manner. And finally, we have competitors, where climate change is increasingly constraining resources. And what I mean by resources is primarily water resources. Currently, about 20% of the world's population lives in regions where water resources are stressed. So if you're a small and medium scale enterprise that relies heavily on water to create a product, this is something of a big concern. And this is something that may need to be addressed beyond the company, but it's a concern, and it's something that companies do need to look at, whether it's finding alternative source of water or a completely alternative source of, or an alternative to water itself. So just to begin with, in terms of giving you some initial steps to think about in terms of how to identify climate risks, one way to do that is to look at historic and recent weather-related information. And this can be found in various places. You can even look at a newspaper to look at what are the recent weather trends. If you do have access to platforms through a university, for instance, that provides data on weather-related events, or the meteorological offices in your countries could provide these information. You would also need tools and guidance to help you build resilience. So information is not enough. You know, one needs to know what to do with this information. And so there are tools and guidances out there that can help you. And again, towards the end of this presentation, I'll leave you with some links to these tools and guidances that can really help you assess whether your business is climate resilient and what you could actually do about it. So now I think I'll stop here and take a quick poll. And so the first question that I want to pose to all of you is, do you actually have historic or recent information on weather events? Do you have access to such information is the question. Is, Okay, so the first question is, has your business experienced effects from climate change? So it's really a yes or no question. And then the second question is, have you previously considered what you can do to protect your company from extreme climate events? So please press the submit button once you've completed the poll so we can see the answers. Okay, fantastic. Thanks to you for participating in this poll. So let's see what we have here. So the first question, has your business experienced effects from climate change? And 84% of you said yes. So this is a real issue that we have to contend with. And I'm glad that all of you are here on this webinar so that we can have this discussion. So the second question, have you previously considered what you can do to protect your company from extreme events? And it looks like many of you have, which is fantastic, because I think later on, I'm definitely going to ask you, what kinds of things have you been doing? So this is great to know. It looks like you're all very proactive in this climate change space. So thank you very much for that. So I will now move on to talk about barriers to integrating risks. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this particular slide, not to discourage you and say that there are so many barriers to integrating risks and adapt to climate change, but these are barriers that we have to be aware of so that all of us can be better at addressing them. So the first real barrier is, of course, access to information. And this is information on types of risks, frequency of risks, and long-term climate trends that are essential for planning and decision-making processes. So information about climate-related risks and uncertainties that is relevant to planning and decision-making processes among small and medium-scale enterprises is sometimes unavailable or inaccessible. Which can lead to businesses to make investments based on gut feelings. And we don't want to make investments based on gut feelings. We would preferably would like to have actual data and information, because this kind of data and information on climate risks will really help us weigh the alternatives to risk reduction options. And as I was briefly saying earlier, that there are several ways in which you can access this information. If you are close to an academic institution or a nonprofit organization or a local agriculture and natural resource organizations, they will most likely have access to climate information. I would also encourage all of you to get together with your other fellow small business owners so that you can really discuss, how are other businesses handling climate risks and how can we learn from it? And maybe even encourage your local Chamber of Commerce to coordinate this kind of meeting with business leaders to discuss climate change issues and what are the different options that you're looking at. The second risk, or barriers to integrating risk rather, is a low ability to evaluate costs and effective adaptation measures. So once risk assessments have been conducted and various adaptation options have been identified, one would need to do a cost-benefit analysis, which could be carried out to assess the price, the operating costs, and sustainability of production. This could also mean comparing the cost of an adaptation option, such as planting a drought-tolerant crop, compared to the cost of planting traditional crops that are not climate resilient, so that you will get a sense of what option is most cost-effective over time. And I know that some businesses may not be aware of doing cost-benefit analysis, but again, I will point you to some simple tools that will help you to do that. The third barrier is finance, and this is a big one. Because even after you conduct risk assessments and you identify cost-effective adaptation options. Limited financial capacity can really impede the implementation of adaptation options. And one reason why small businesses sometimes are not able to access funds is because many banks and other financial intermediaries are actually reluctant to provide loans to small businesses just because they themselves are really unaware of climate risks, and these kinds of risks may appear very high to certain banks. And of course, the other reason is the rising costs of actually implementing certain types of options that could help you reduce the impacts of climate change. A lot of these options could have upfront cost. They could have relatively long payback times and uncertainties. And so these are all factors that we have to consider in terms of choosing what types of options we want to implement to reduce the impacts of droughts and floods. Technical capacity or low technical capacity is another barrier. In some businesses may or may not know, what kinds of technical capacity that they may need to actually implement an option. For instance, if a company is very new to a drought tolerant or flood tolerant crop or plant species, they may not know how to manage that and how to take care of these types of very particular types of plant that are climate resilient. So lots of technical capacity needs to be built. And there are examples of this. For instance, an example that I've come across in Ethiopia is the government has actually played a very key role in terms of reaching out to small businesses and helping them to build their capacity to understand what it takes to actually grow drought tolerant crops. And so this relationship between small and medium scale enterprises and the government are also very key. There are also big multinational companies that actually invest in a lot of small businesses that are mostly part of their supply chain. Companies like Cafe Direct, Unilever, they actually provide, in certain cases, for instance, I've come across an example in Zambia where these kinds of companies are actually training smallholder farmers to figure out what are the different climate resilient seeds that they should plant and that they would have access to. And going back to the issue of being well connected to the government, I mean, another barrier is unsupportive policies. And of course, there could be unsupportive policies that small enterprises could face that could prevent them from accessing water in a cost-effective manner, for instance. However, the government still plays an important role, and it's worthwhile to connect to government agencies, local government agencies, to get that access to knowledge, get that access to technical training, if possible, even though in certain parts of the world, government policies may not be that conducive, they can still help in certain ways. And of course, we also should look at the social acceptance of adaptation options. This is the last barrier, because depending on culture, there may be certain adaptation options that are conceived or perceived to be less suitable, because men and women have different types of perceptions of risk. Actually, the evidence shows that men actually have a lower perception of risk than women. So depending on who is in your company, who is making the decision, it would be really good to look at the risk factor and risk tolerance factor based on the men and women in your company and what kinds of adaptation options that they are comfortable with depending on their level of risk. So I want to stop there now, and I would like to actually pose a question. And this is actually not a poll, and I hope we can pose a question. So the question that I wanted to pose is, what kind of barriers have you faced? In the chat box, please. What kind of barriers have you faced and why? So we're just about to send that question to you in the chat box. Okay, great. Thank you all for participating in this. Let me see what we have. So someone has mentioned low technical capacity, capacity to implement, culture of the community to leave women in the front line. That's interesting. Government regulation, finances and social stereotypes, so which is some of the barriers that were just mentioned. Women are meant for house activities. That's also interesting. Major issues is that I don't know which options are available to me. So we will definitely get to that. I will provide you with a list of options for you to consider. There's also someone said financial barriers and technical capacity. That seems to be a very common one. Defining the business case, okay. And then there's insufficient technical and financial assistance to train smallholder farmers to adopt climate change strategies, limited finance and resources, low technical capacities. This is not a daily topic. That's good to know as well. Community is being skeptical. So that's also interesting. So it seems like you want to maybe perhaps implement an adaptation option, but it's not being accepted in your community perhaps. Mentalities and culture. Unsupportive policies and regulations. In my country, many people may not know the consequences of climate change, cultural aspects. So it seems like the finance, the technical capacity and culture seems to be the top 3 barriers that we're facing right now, which is good to know. So the second question I actually want to pose is, now that you've mentioned these barriers, what kinds of support do you actually need to adapt to climate change? And this is important for us to know, especially the World Resources Institute, as you may know, is an international research organization, and we are always looking for ways to support small and medium scale enterprises to become climate resilient. So this would be very good for us to know. So we're just posing this question. Yes. Yes, and please answer in the chat box.
Everybody, as you're thinking of a list of things you might need, when you're in the chat box, if you can click where it says message send chat to all panelists and click on the down arrow, it will give you the option to send to all panelists and attendees, and that way everybody can see your answer as well. If you don't do this, don't worry, but you feel free to send your answer again, checked to all panelists and attendees, and that way everybody can see all of your answers. We'll see it, but so will the other 30 or so folks who are joining us today. Looking forward to getting those answers as well.
Great, and it actually looks like we have a lot of interesting answers coming in. So let me see if I can mention a few of them here. So some of the needs here are a list of things to do for managing directors, okay? Information technology that works and the means of application, financial and technical support, availability of literature on climate change. I will definitely be providing that towards the end. Some training, someone saying, I'm on the verge of starting a new business to help rural women in order to create means of income, okay? Well, I think the Land Accelerator is a fantastic way to get some training on how to integrate climate risks into business planning. Change of government policies to uphold climate change. We need capacity in identification of risks and options. Yes, so I will be talking about a couple of options in a minute. I'd like to have expert I can ask questions to. So we'll definitely have a Q&A session towards the end. So you can definitely pose a few questions that I hope I will be able to answer. Okay, so let's see here. Another need is defining what's in it for businesses other than the brand and feel good factor. Proper and conducive government policies, followed by actual and realistic interventions. We have a lot of training and funding to execute our projects. Okay, that's good. We need more social engagement and training, need finances, support promoting climate resilient messages and finance partnerships. Climate change is a problem we created together, so it must be solved together. Yes, absolutely. Interpretation of the terminology that allows the local resource users to design risk mitigation, okay. And documented materials and practical examples to pass knowledge to the community. Okay, these are really great. There's a ton more, which, which will be a little tough to go over all of them. But it seems like, of course, the need for finance, need for training, those are absolutely key. And it also seems like, government policies that are very supportive, to help small businesses grow, but also address climate change is a critical factor. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with all of us. Okay, so let me then go to my next slide, which is really about giving you some adaptation options. Just one moment, please. How do I get back to my slides? Is it? Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay. All right. So the next slide is really about adaptation options. Yes, that one. Yes, fantastic. Okay, so the first option is use of climate resilient seed varieties. So let's say you're growing a particular crop and you are facing droughts very regularly, and this crop just cannot keep producing at the level it is because of these drought-like situations. So in this case, you may have to look at what other available climate resilient crops out there that can be conducive to very dry conditions. And the similar factor with when you have floods, and you need to look for flood tolerant varieties. And this type of information can be found through extension agents that are actually part of the government, but they have a lot of information on what could be good flood and drought resilient seed varieties. So the next is adopt climate resilient pest management. And what I mean by that is really looking at integrated pest management, which means you are using different types of pests to get rid of other pests, if that makes any sense. So this is not just about spraying your fields or spraying the trees that you're growing. This is really about making sure that you have certain types of pests, because pests are growing with climate change, because as the world gets warmer and warmer, we are seeing a rising trend in more pests and diseases in plants. So it's important to be aware of what kinds of pests are growing that's negatively affecting your crops or your trees, but then also be aware of what certain pests could actually help you. There are actually good pests out there that can actually help you combat other pests that are creating a negative impact. The second is to restore trees to improve soil and water quality and quantity. So trees are incredible in the sense that they can actually help not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they can also help restore soil and water quality. And this is especially if you're in the agroforestry world or agriculture world, where you would want to plant certain types of trees that are probably not water intensive, that could really help you restore the land that you're growing your products on. The next is maintain drainage systems to reduce water logging in flood-prone areas. So if you're in a part of Africa where there's a lot of floods, actually building concrete drainage systems may help. And I know that this is a huge investment. It's a very expensive investment. So this is when you might need to engage with your local government to see what can be done, what kind of finances are there to help you get access to this drainage system. The second is build water tanks, dams, and basins to collect and store water in drought-prone areas. So you need ways in which to collect whatever rainfall that comes your way. And this is very, very important and critical, especially in most parts of Africa, which are drying. There are more drought-like conditions than flood-like conditions in most parts of Africa. So this is an important option. You might want to set up drip irrigation systems for drought-prone areas as well. Drip irrigation can be expensive. Again, this might be, if you're looking into this option, you might have to engage with your local government to get finances or get access to drip irrigation. But this is a very water-efficient way to keep your crops alive or your trees alive. Subscribe to real-time weather information services. This is a big one. I think more and more of us are relying on our mobile phones where we get information. Subscribing to weather alerts or subscribing to certain extension agencies may have their own systems in place where they provide weather information bundled with insurance information or advice on agriculture and trees. So there are lots of possibilities, and I would highly encourage you to kind of find out what is available in your area, because the more real-time and location-sensitive information that you can get, the better. And finally, the weather-based crop insurance. So this is quite prevalent in the agriculture world, where if your crops fail due to droughts, you can get compensation, financial compensation that can help you rebuild your business. So these are some of the adaptation options that I've come across with. There may be more, but I want to pause right now and pose another question, which is, what adaptation options have you considered and why? Again, please use your chat box to reply to this question. Which adaptation options have you considered and why? Well, so far, someone has said we help farmers in our portfolio adapt by originating solar irrigation loans to them. Okay. Solar-powered boreholes, fantastic. I have built small dams for storing water for my farms because my area is prone to drought. Wonderful. Solar-powered boreholes are easy to maintain and have no emissions. Climate resilience agronomy practices such as mulching because they are cost-effective. Great. Vegetable source preservation and storage for future use. Okay, fantastic. These are great adaptation options. Maybe just 1 or 2 more minutes, because I know that you have at least practiced one of these options or implemented one of these options. Okay, great. We help farmers plant trees to improve soil structure, soil and water conservation works such as terracing, planting trees. Okay. Okay, there are a few more coming in again. Opting for an integration of traditional knowledge and emerging technology. That would be interesting, to merge traditional technology and modern technology. Agroforestry practices that offer shade to crops like coffee. We advocate farmers to manage waste and uphold organic farming to restore their soils, providing fuel-saving stoves. Being an agroforestry service provider, most of them, but agroforestry requires an investment from clients not available in developing countries. All right, soil and water conservation, such as dead level contours to increase infiltration. Fantastic. So it seems like all of you, as we started out earlier in the poll, that all of you are very proactive in this climate change space. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your adaptation options. It's really great to see this taking place. So I actually wanted to leave you with, yes, this next slide, which is excuse me, steps for you to, or yeah, steps for assessing climate risks and options. So these are a couple of questions that would be really good for you to pose to yourself, actually. Have you assessed and prioritized risks according to their magnitude and likelihood? So if you're facing floods or droughts, have you thought about, how intense are these, and how likely is it that I will continue to face droughts and floods? Because having that kind of information, or at least thinking about it, will help you decide what kind of options that you want to implement now and perhaps in the future. Another question is, what kinds of adaptation options could you put in place to protect your company, and why? And what are the potential costs of inaction? So if you didn't do anything at all, what would be that cost to your business? So I think most of you do think that it's extremely important to implement adaptation options, but this is a good question to ask yourself in terms of maybe in all parts of your operation, and make your operations really climate resilient. So I wanted to leave you with a couple of slides on resources. The first is actually a really great website where you can actually get information on climate risks. It's called the Climate Change Knowledge Portal. It's completely free, and you can get information on climate risks per country around the world. The second is this particular resource is about how to strengthen your value chain. And this particular resource has really 5 great steps to actually help you, use and identify ways in which you can strengthen your value chain against the impacts of climate change. It provides you a series of questions with steps for you to reflect on to come up with solutions, and helps you identify risks and opportunities as well. So it's a very, very easy to use and useful resource. The second is, if you're looking for case studies, if you're looking to see what other companies have done, what other countries have done to address climate change, this would be a good source, business and climate adaptation toward resilient companies and communities. The fourth is, again, another good publication. It's a pretty thick publication, but it has a really nice chapter actually on enabling instruments. So what are the things that you might need to help you enable and implement adaptation options? And I want to leave you with the last slide on resources. These are all WRI publications. So Adapting from the Ground Up looks specifically at the impacts of climate change on small and medium scale enterprises around the world, and what kind of barriers they face, and what governments and private sector can actually do to help reduce the impacts of climate change. We have a series of wonderful publications related to restoration. One is Business of Planting Trees. The other is Roots of Prosperity. These all look at the restoration economy. and especially the role of companies, as well as in the publication attracting private investment to landscape restoration. So with that, I thank you very much for your time.